Okay, so today we're looking at a verse that appears in this week's Torah portion. This week we're reading about this. We continue reading about the story of Avraham, and we're looking specifically at the statement he says, "I am but dust and ashes." Anochi afar ve'efer. Those famous words of humility. So let's look at the verses in the context. Chapter 18. That's what it says there, the bold, our Parsha, chapter 18. And essentially, this is while Avraham Avinu is negotiating, trying to negotiate with God in an effort to save the people of Sodom. The people of Sodom, who Hashem decided he was going to destroy the city, considering their evil nature. And Avraham Avinu is negotiating. So he begins by saying, I'm going to find 50 people who are worthy of your compassion. And Hashem says, yeah, don't worry. If you find 50, I'm going to save the whole city. He can't find 50, and he keeps on lowering the number. If I find 40 people that are worthy of saving, will you save them? God says yes, and he keeps on going lower and lower and lower. And the end is he can't find anybody worthy of saving, and he just saving his nephew Lot, and the city is destroyed. So in this negotiation, Avraham says the following. So verse 27. And Avraham answered and said, "Behold, now I have commenced to speak to the Lord. I am but dust and ashes, although I am dust and ashes." It's part of his plea. He's approaching God, asking God to save people. So he begins by saying, look, I'm not worthy. I'm a nobody. I'm dust and ashes, but still, can you please save them? That's the context in which Avraham Avinu says these words. If you go to the next text, you'll see the Gemara in Sotah. The Gemara tractate Sotah. It's the second text on the first page in Hebrew and English. So I'll read it in English. But essentially, before we just to explain what Sotah is, the law of Sotah, which is this tractate, this section of the Talmud is dedicated to the law of a married woman who's suspect of infidelity. And if there are no witnesses to either confirm that she was indeed unfaithful or confirm that she was indeed innocent, then in temple times, she would have been brought to the Holy Temple by a whole process, which concluded with her drinking a cup of water. And in that water, they mixed a little bit of earth taken from the ground of the temple, specifically from the ground of the temple. They had a special handle on a tile. They'll lift up, take ashes from dust or earth from there. That would be mixed into the water. There's another ingredient, if I remember correctly, additionally, they would write out a certain section of the Torah, the section describing the Sotah law, write it out on a parchment, take that parchment, put it into the water, mix it so that all the ink came off, and then she would drink it. And this drink, with the divine power that's in it, would either confirm her guilt when she would later pass as a result of drinking that water, or it would be a source of her blessing. If she was innocent, it would be a source of her blessing, and she would have children. If she didn't have children, if she had a hard time having children, she'd have an easier time having children. She would get restored health, and so on. So this is the process of the Sotah. Drinking this water in which there was earth mixed in, which would either be blessing or, God forbid, the opposite. So in this tractate, the section of the Talmud which discusses this law, the following statement is made. Before I forget, I want to do this at the beginning. I completely forgot. I was asked to dedicate this class to the neshama of Shani Bas Rivka, as one of the women who were found to be dead, murdered. She has, I think, a cousin here in Montreal, and was requested to dedicate the learning to her neshama and the merit and success of all our soldiers in their mission. They all be unharmed. And actually, I also want to say that when we come to the end of this class, I think it'll loop back to a little bit, maybe perhaps, about our attitude towards what's going on. Okay, so to the Gemara in Sotah. The Gemara says the following statement in English. Additionally, Rava says, for what reason did the Torah say, bring dust for the Sotah? Right, again, to take some dust from the ground of the temple, put it into the water for her to drink. So continues the Gemara. It is because if she merits to be proven faithful after drinking the water of the Saita, a child like our paycheck, Avraham will emerge from her. As it is written with regard to Avraham, that he said, I'm dust and ashes. Okay, so part of the blessing is, if she's innocent, that not only she give birth, if she couldn't, or she had a hard time, she has an easier time, but her children will be blessed to be as special as Avraham. Because Avraham made that association with himself to dust. And she's here drinking dust, as per Torah description, so she gets that blessing. But if she does not merit to be proven faithful after drinking the water of the Saita, and shall die, pass away, and return to dust, the soil from which mankind was formed. So again, there's a dust association. Avraham calls himself dust, she's drinking dust, and the dust is either a blessing like Avraham, or God forbid the opposite, burying, essentially. Rava further taught, as a reward for that which our prachek Avraham said, which we just read from our parsha, I am but dust and ashes, his children merited to two mitzvahs, the ashes of the red heifer and the dust of the Saita. So Avraham says, I am dust and ashes. Says the Gemara, because Avraham said, I am dust and ashes, therefore the Jewish people merit to a mitzvah, one of dust and one of ashes. The mitzvah of dust is this mitzvah of the Saita. She drinks this mixture in which there is included dust, in association with Avraham calling himself dust, and she's blessed to have a child like Avraham, or God forbid the opposite, dust. Additionally, there's another mitzvah that the Jewish people have received in merit of Avraham saying, I'm dust and ashes, specifically one associated with ashes. The mitzvah with ashes is the mitzvah of the red heifer. The mitzvah of the red heifer, in brief, essentially is the process by which, in temple times, one would become ritually pure after ritual impurification. I'm adding the word ritual because pure doesn't mean, God forbid, vile. It's ritual impurity. That is to say, the person has come in contact with a corpse, which isn't a bad thing. In fact, sometimes it's a mitzvah to do so, to go to a funeral. But nonetheless, doing so would render someone ritually impure. So essentially, we're all ritually impure because we've all been to funerals, and none of us have done the red heifer process. So we would all be barred from going into the temple area, even the Temple Mount, past the area where the temple once stood. We could not walk there. So in order to be able to re-enter into the temple area, one have to go through a process of purification. And part of the process of purification is, after a red heifer, a red cow was slaughtered, it would be put on like this pyre of wood, and it would be burned to ashes, and that ashes would again be mixed into water and sprinkled on the person in this process of a 7-day process on day 3 and day 7. And then the person would become ritually pure and be allowed to enter into the temple. In temple times, basically, people only did this before Pesach, or before Sukkot, before Shavuos, when you have to actually go to the temple. Otherwise, the majority of people just remained like us, ritually impure. Unless you were a Kohen and you had to go there all the time, then you were busy with the red heifer. But for most people, it was a thing they did maybe once, twice, 3 times a year when they were going to the temple. So these are the two mitzvahs, one associated with ashes and one associated with dust. And the Gemara is telling us, because Abraham called himself dust and ashes, therefore the Jewish people get 2 mitzvahs. One associated with dust, the Saita law, where she drinks, this suspected woman drinks a mixture that includes dust. And we get the mitzvah of ashes, which is, again, actually water too, where the purification process of a person includes ashes. We clear so far? Okay. So the question we're going to address is, besides for the word association, what's the actual association? So there's a word association. Avraham calls himself dust and ashes in his humility. And because he happens to use these 2 terms, we get mitzvahs that are associated with these 2 words, like a mitzvah with dust and a mitzvah with ashes. So there's a word association, but is there anything deeper? Is there a deeper connection between humility and these mitzvahs? Where in the mitzvah of Saita do we find humility? Or some association to Avraham and the mitzvah of the red heifer, and the ashes of the red heifer? Where do we see that association with Avraham? Are we clear where we're going? Yeah. So beyond the word association, is there anything deeper going on here? So we have 4 different little texts we'll look at. I'm not going to read and translate the whole thing because they're in Hebrew, but you're welcome to look at them. The first is on page 2 at the top there. There's a commentary which points out that Avraham didn't just say he was dust and ashes, but actually engaged in a level of humility or level of dedication, in effect, connected to dust and ashes. The first is the story of Avraham as he's thrown into the furnace before God tells him to leave his land. We spoke about this last time. He is challenged by King Nimrod, and for his faith and belief in monotheism and his antagonism toward paganism of the time, Nimrod being chief amongst these pagans. And in this challenge, Avraham is cast into the furnace and miraculously emerges. But he was willing to be reduced to ashes. So he didn't just say, I'm ashes, but he actually put his actions where his speech is, and actually was willing to become ashes. Additionally, when Avraham fought off the 4 kings to defend his nephew and the others who were attacked by these 4 kings, he uses dust to fight them off. So he put himself at risk in a form of dust. So it's not just that he called himself dust and ashes, but actually his behavior matched that. He was willing to be reduced to ashes, and he was, in effect, putting himself in the hands, as it were, in dust as he battled these 4 kings. So that's point number 1. So we're getting a little bit more than just, there's a word association. He says, I'm dust and ashes as a kind of metaphor for his humility. So we get 2 mitzvahs of dust and ashes. But actually, he engaged in behavior that literally was connected to dust and ashes. Yeah, point 1. Clear so far? Very good. Point 2. What's the connection between dust and ashes and these 2 mitzvahs, the red heifer and the saita? So the second commentary here on page 2, again, you can read it in Hebrew, but I'll just explain what he says in English. Essentially, he says like this. Imagine a person is hosting guests, and there's a very special, honored person that's coming to grace the table. So the host wants to have this special person sit right up front, but this special person, his humility, sits at the other end. So instead of the host schlepping the guy to come forward, he just makes that the head of the table, sits next to the honored guest, and just brings everything there, just turning everything around. He doesn't move anywhere, just stays right where he is and turns that into the honor. So he says Hashem is doing the same thing. Avraham, in his humility, calls himself dust and ashes, and Hashem says, you're dust and ashes. Ooh, it's a mitzvah. We turn dust and ashes not into humility, but something of a point of pride. It's a mitzvah. Right? So it's a kind of like not so much that the saita and the red heifer are somehow connected to humility, but actually it's a way of God taking his humility and turning it around on him. You're trying to belittle yourself by saying you're nothing but dust and ashes. Hashem says dust and ashes are not nothing. It's a mitzvah. He made that the head of the table. Instead of dust and ashes being something to be looked down at, it's something looked up to. The ashes bring purification. The dust brings blessing to the woman and restores faith in the marriage. So it's a wonderful thing. We turned this humility, that which he belittles himself with, we turned it into a positive. Yeah, commentary number 1. Number 2 comes on page 3. Another commentary which reads like this. Humility is the key to actually both of these mitzvahs. Right, the first mitzvah, which one? The previous one? Oh, sorry. Humility is the key to these 2 mitzvahs. The first mitzvah, which is the first one, the saita, which has the dust, which is all about preventing, let's say, misconduct, if we call it that, right? And at the root of this kind of misconduct is the, I guess you can call it arrogance, or the self, what's the word I'm looking for? That I get what I want. Selfishness, self-fulfillment. I get what I want. It hurts other people, too bad, I get what I want. So humility is actually what stays at the core to prevent these kinds of issues. The mitzvah of saita is meant to prevent that kind of issues. It's precisely the point. The mitzvah of saita is a deterrent. That one shouldn't behave in such a manner considering the results. Which, by the way, I should add at this point, the Gemara tells us that when she drinks the water, the same divine power that tells us of her innocence also tells us of his innocence. So of his innocence. So if the husband was misbehaving, but instead was dragging his wife along and she drinks the water, he ends up getting the punishment, not her. Just I should add that it's not just a preventative issue for her not to misbehave, but for him too. And at the core of preventing this kind of misbehavior is humility. Okay. a faithful humility to curb one's own self-indulgence for the sake of their relationship. And additionally, the same thing is true of the other mitzvah, which is the mitzvah of the red heifer. The red heifer, which brings about purity. Right? And purity at its core is humility. Right? The nature of impurity, at least in its spiritual sense, is a sense of arrogance. I'm here, I declare, I want, and purity is the opposite, humility. So now we're making a really deeper connection between the humility of dust and ashes and these two mitzvahs. Because the humility of Avraham is what is at the core of these two mitzvahs. The way to deal with impurity is, in the spiritual sense at least, is humility, and the way to deal with urges that might lead to this kind of misbehavior is a little humility, which is what Avraham declares by saying, I'm dust and ashes. You clear so far? We're building our picture. Finally, the Rebbe's comment starts on the bottom of page 3 and continues on page 4. So I'm going to read and translate in Hebrew because it's actually very beautiful, the bottom of page 3. So if you look at the second half of page 3, first they quote the relevant section, right, in the big bold. They quote the verse, and then they quote the Gemara. Then the next paragraph, the Rebbe asks the question, what's the relationship between dust and ashes and these two specific mitzvahs of the red heifer and the Saita water? And then goes the Rebbe's explanation. So the bottom paragraph on page 3. I'm going to read it with an Ashkenazic pronunciation. Hope that's okay with everybody. Ma'alasai shel Avraham haisa. The virtue of Avraham was bekach, in the fact that shehirgis atzmai shafal menakal, he felt himself to be below all in his humility. And therefore, hirgish, he felt shalov l'sayei lezulas, it's on him to help another, the lasais imay chesed, and to do kindness to the other, gam al cheshben tevasa pratis, even on the expense of his own benefit. So it's not just about being nice, but it's about being humble to the point that I'll be nice even if it cost me. And indeed, as described in the previous parsha, where we had the story of Avraham with the dust, throwing dust. Avram risked his own life, because in natural means he should have not won that war. And fights 4 kings, in order to save his nephew light. So it's not just he's being nice to his nephew, he's putting his life at risk for his nephew. It's much more than just being nice. Moreover, top of page 4, this is classic Rebbe. You say to Mizu, moreover, not only this, that Avram put into danger his own physical life in order to help another. He also was ready to forgo al dargas ruchnis kavoyas matarazu, on lofty spiritual levels for this purpose of helping someone else. He was willing to forgo his own lofty spiritual levels for the sake of this purpose of helping someone else. And as described in the beginning of this week's parsha, when Avraham sees that 3 people arrive, or at least he thinks they're people, and moreover, he sees them as literally Arabs who are idol worshippers. He forgoes the great lofty spiritual standing of greeting Hashem, and wants to go and bring them into his home. So he's not just forgoing his own physical life for the sake of helping another human, actually. He's willing to forgo his own spiritual standing, even though he's having a conversation with Hashem, which is the highest possible thing a person could possibly ask for in terms of spiritual achievement. And he tells God, hold on a second, there's some people I got to go feed. It's essentially what he does. The Rebbe continues, in reward for this conduct, Shel Avram Avinu, Shel Avram of Avraham, Nitnu Labanav was granted to his children, mitzvahs Ephar Para, mitzvahs Afar Saita. The mitzvah of the red heifer, the ashes of the red heifer, which brings about purity for those who are ritually impure, and the mitzvah of the dust of the Saita, which she drinks and then restores faith, peace, and blessing in the home. Shebeshtayen, in both of these mitzvahs, Mizbata has expressed Ikroim Zu, this fundamental, namely, Vitir al Dagra Ruchnius, foregoing one's own spiritual standing in order to help a fellow. How so? So they're explained. The mitzvah's paraduma, in the mitzvah of the red heifer, hadinhu, the law is, shekol hamisaskim para, all those who are involved in the process of preparing these ashes, nitmeim, they themselves become impure. So kolemar, this means to say, shakoyin, the priest, shetafkid l'shares b'mikdash, whose job it is to serve in the temple, mitach kedusha v'tara, on the highest levels of holiness and purity, nidrash is required lavatal ar dargat taras v'kdashasai, to forgo his own purity, his own only holiness, in order to help a Jew who's impure at a lower level. So as a result of him, this priest, purifying the Jew who's impure, and thus allowing that Jew to enter the temple, he in turn can't go to the temple until he's pured. So he's foregoing his own spiritual standing for the sake of elevating another Jew. Following the model of Avraham, who's willing to, first of all, put his own life at risk for his fellow, and willing to forego his own spiritual lofty state for the sake of another. And likewise, and this is even taking this even farther. The mitzvahs of our saita, when it comes to the dust of the saita, in order to restore peace between husband and wife, Amra Torah says, Shmi shenichta b'kedusha, my name, says God, that was written in holiness, Yim chalamayim, should be erased in the water. I mentioned earlier that part of the ingredients in the water that she drank, it was water, pure water that came from a special well, dust from the floor of the temple, and a scroll on which there was written the text of the Torah that describes the Saita should be erased into that water. That paragraph includes Hashem's name, which must be erased, which ordinarily is a serious offense. God's name, you don't want to erase God's name, especially from a Torah, from a scroll written with, okay, this wasn't from a Torah, it's written on a special scroll, but the scroll has to be written with the same laws that a Torah is written, with an ink and a parchment and all the holiness of it. And then it's got to be erased. So Hashem says, not just the Kohen or Avraham is giving up on his own spiritual standing for the sake of the benefit of another. Hashem himself, as it were, is giving up on his own holiness for the sake of peace between husband and wife. He continues, this means to say, the Kohen has to now erase God's name, Pa'ula, an action, which is the most profane activity, erasing God's name. In order to help a woman, and what kind of woman? A woman suspect of infidelity. It's not as if he's doing this to help someone who's has a stellar reputation. We're talking about someone who has a very questionable reputation. Because if she actually made it to the temple, it means there is the whole process for getting there is a long process. She has to go through one level of court, another level of court. It means at this point, there's a very serious suspicion that she was not behaving the way she's supposed to. And even if she wasn't absolutely unfaithful, she certainly wasn't exactly the most modest of people. Her and the two of them. And yet, it's for her that the Kohen goes and erases God's name. Vad, so long as it's going to bring peace between husband and wife. And this is what the Jews are inheriting when Avraham says, I'm dust and ashes. It's not simply to be humble or to be nice, but it's to be giving to the point, even if it means risking one's own self and even one's own spiritual level. And not for the sake of another person who's also on equal footing with me. Avraham risked his life to save Lot. He wasn't exactly the nicest of people. And he went to go greet guests while talking to Hashem, forgoing his conversation with Hashem to greet people who he thought were idol worshippers. Likewise here, the Kohen is becoming impure, but trying to purify someone else who's of a lower level, someone who's impure at the highest level that requires this red heifer. And likewise, the name of Hashem being erased, which is the highest spiritual thing possible, for the sake of bringing peace between people who themselves are questionable in their behavior. So this ends the commentary on this little verse. I'm just going to add the following and bring it back to perhaps our attitude to what's going on.
Yeah. Why does he become impure?
That's the halacha, because he handles the ashes which come. That's the halacha. It becomes impure, not in the same level of the impurity that he's purifying you. It's a lower level of impurity, but he still nonetheless becomes impure, and he has to go through a short process of purification. I think it lasts a day, if I remember correctly.
But we don't really know why this happens.
It's the halacha. It's the halacha. And maybe this is the reason. Maybe the reason is to send a message. You can't stay on your high mighty horse and say, "Oh, I'm purifying you." No. Level with the person you're talking to, and you get your hands a little dirty when you're trying to help someone else. Maybe that itself is the message, right? Correct. These are the people that require the red heifer, people who escort a dead body. So I'm going to add the following. The Zohar makes the following remark about three people who dealt with a community of sinners. So you have Noach, you have Avraham, and you have Moshe. And the Zohar makes the following comment. When Noah was told that the generation is corrupt, and therefore Hashem says, go build an ark and I'm going to save you. So the instruction is that he take 120 years to build that, so that people will ask him, why are you building? And he'll explain, because God is going to destroy the world, because it's all corrupt. And hopefully that will inspire them to change their ways. So he, says the Zohar, didn't go out of his way to defend anyone. He made himself available. And if someone comes to ask him, he'll try to inspire. The next stage is Avraham, who in this week's parsha, we just read the story. He is negotiating with Hashem to save the depraved people of Sodom. But he doesn't pray to save them for themselves. He tells Hashem, I'm going to find people that are worthy of saving and then save everybody else on their behalf. So he doesn't directly defend the sinner. He puts his he's negotiating with Hashem, which itself is a dangerous activity. But he does so, with a kind of with a certain barrier of self-defense. Like, I'm not asking you to forgive people who are sinners, but maybe there's going to be holy people there. Right? The next level, says the Zohar, is Moshe Rabbeinu, who in the face of Jews who worship the golden calf, he turns to Hashem and says, defend them, save them, these sinners, or I'm out. Which is the highest level that what we're describing here. Someone who's willing to risk everything for the sake of defending, not good people, but sinners. Sorry. So why am I sharing this all now? What's this relevance to what's going on? It's very, very important that we remain positive and speak positively about our fellow Jews, especially when our fellow Jews are going through such a difficult time. It exists out there in the world, present company excluded, but it exists out there in the world, a tendency where some people will try to say, well, you see, there's this sin and that sin and one sin and another sin. That's not the way of the Jewish people. That's not the way we are. That's not the way we're taught. That's not the way of Avraham Avinu. That's not the way of Moshe Rabbeinu. That's not the way of the Jewish people to, God forbid, point out negative about another Jew, especially when they are in a time when they require divine mercy. And even if that means that I'm going to look a little less holy, so be it. Be a little less holy. If it means I can have a positive association to defend and speak and highlight positive about our fellow Jews, even if objectively speaking, they're sinners of the golden calf. It's irrelevant. It's completely irrelevant, right? We are not, God forbid, God's lawyers. He doesn't need any. We're lawyers of the Jewish people, right? So, and that's our job as fellow Jews, to look at our fellow Jew and to only see positive, and to only highlight positive, only speak positively. The power of speech is very impactful, right? I'll just conclude with this. The Gemara famously says that lashon hara, evil or negative speech, affects the one speaking, affects the one listening, and affects the one who we're speaking about. And the commentators discuss this, like, well, what did the guy we're talking about do wrong? Why is he affected by the negative speech? Yeah, I'm speaking, okay, that's my problem. The person listening, maybe they should have stopped me or something like that. They're engaging in the conversation. But what did the other guy do wrong? It's our problem. So the Rebbe explains, because when a Jew speaks, it has the power. It has the power to concretize that which is being spoken about. So if there are things that exist, okay, they exist, and whatever, they remain in existence. But when it's spoken out, it becomes like a thing that's now on the table for discussion that we have to think about and look at. So by talking negative about someone else's negative, now we concretize that person's negativity, and now it's something to contend with, to think about, to work with. And that's not the way of the Jewish people. As we're learning here, even if it means that my level of holiness is not going to be at the highest standard, It's okay. Associate with the fellow Jew, associate positively with the fellow Jew, highlight the positive in another Jew, and God forbid, not to speak negatively, especially when clearly the forces of negative are what's the word?
Dominant.
Not God forbid dominant, but they're swinging. They're definitely swinging hard. And we don't want to give them a good pitch for them to hit. We want to keep it positive, speaking positive, and only speaking of good and positive, because every single Jew, as the Mishnah declares, is a tzaddik. Every single Jew has positive, and it's our job as fellow Jews to highlight that and to think about that and to speak about that. So that's a little thought on this parsha, and very pertinent and powerful takeaway. A wonderful day. Thank you all for giving me the time.
You wanted to say Tehillim?
Yeah, we should definitely say Tehillim.